So thank you also, Ugo, for the opportunity to present here at this nice event. And as you maybe recognized, our team focused or did a lot of research on isometric muscle actions. And we not only investigating the isometric adaptive force like Frank presented yesterday, or Laura today about the oscillatory behavior. So we are also interested in hemodynamic responses. And yeah, there we found triggered regulation of the venous capillary hemoglobin amount, which is an indicator of the blood filling. And the findings I want to present you today refers to the superficial muscle tissue during a fatiguing or doing two different fatiguing isometric muscle actions. So, but let me give you some background information first. So as generally known, the blood flow during exercise is necessary to maintain homeostasis in muscle fibers. However, the mechanical pressure during isometric muscle actions could be a hindrance because the pressure increases proportionally to the maximal voluntary isometric contraction. And this might impede the intramuscular capillary blood flow already at low intensities like 15% of the MVIC. And consequently, the oxygen saturation and blood filling might be affected, which are our main parameters of interest in the present study. In a previous one, we found two different behavioral patterns which occurred during a fatiguing isometric holding muscle action. And these two patterns I want to show you right now. The type 1 behavior showed a decrease of the oxygen saturation directly at the after the start of loading, and then it levels off into a steady state, and the relative hemoglobin amount behaved nearly parallel to it, with a positive rank correlation of 0.7. In contrast, the RHB behaved nearly opposing to the oxygen saturation in type 2 measurements. So it decreased first, then increased after a reversal point and leveled off into a steady state nearly at the same time point as the SVO2, the oxygen saturation, did. So this opposing behavior resulted in a negative rank correlation of 0.5. And these two patterns were found in different studies, and maybe explain why there are differences between the results in the past. So, but not only the behavior of the relative hemoglobin amount differed between the types, also the extent of deoxygenation. So in type 1 measurements, the SpO2 decreased about 10 percent points in the measured sample, and in type 2 measurements about 3 times more. So our objective of the present study was to ascertain an explanation of these two behavioral patterns. And because in type 2 measurements, deoxygenation was greater than in type 1 measurements, we hypothesized that the increase of the blood filling at this reversal point is triggered by the oxygenation level. To figure this out, we've measured 12 healthy subjects with a mean age of about 30 years, and they had to perform a fatiguing holding isometric muscle action of the biceps brachii muscle with 60% of the maximal voluntary isometric contraction. And therefore they had to hold a weight in a 90-degree elbow flexion and for as long as possible. And they did this task with both arms. In a subgroup of 6 subjects, or a subgroup of 6 subjects had to pull additionally on an immovable resistance in a seating position with the same intensity and elbow flexion. Then we recorded the relative hemoglobin amount and the capillary venous oxygen saturation by use of the O2C spectrophotometer, and we haven't any founding of this study. That's why we acknowledge the technical support of the LIA Medicine Technik company in Germany. The measuring principle is very similar to the commonly used NIRS technique. The O2C device uses white light instead of near-infrared light. So the white light is sent into the tissue, and it depends on the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, how much light is backscattered, and then the relative amount of hemoglobin is calculated, and also the intensity or the wavelength of the backscattered light, which can be used for calculation of the SVO2, the oxygen saturation. So we used, for that we used the probe LF3, and the specification of that probe allows for a measuring depth of 12 millimeters. So we are only in the superficial muscle tissue. In this table, you can see that the numbers of measurements allocated to type 1 and type 2, and you can see that both types were found in holding isometric muscle actions and also in pulling isometric muscle actions. And that's why we didn't make a difference between these tasks in the next step. So what we wanted to know now was at which oxygenation level the RHB increased. So this reversal point, we wanted to know at which oxygenation level this reversal point occurred. And this is depicted here in this figure. So these are all type 2 assigned measurements, the oxygenation level at this specific point. And you can see that the average oxygenation level at this point was about 58.75%. The twofold standard deviations were very close, so about 4%. And in type 1 measurements, which haven't shown a reversal point, the minimal values are depicted here in red. And you can see that the oxygenation level were never below that specific value. So in conclusion, the extent of deoxygenation could be explained the two patterns. And reaching a threshold of around 59% seems to trigger an increase of the relative hemoglobin amount or the blood filling. And this triggered regulation might impede further deoxygenation, which could be harmful for the tissue or not so good when we want to exercise. So future research should regard whether our findings can be replicated by examining different muscles, intensities, and deeper regions of the muscles, and also younger and older persons, because we examined the mid-aged people. So what could also be important is the physiological mechanism behind the triggered regulation of the blood filling. We only measured the two parameters SVO2 and RHB, which depend on each other or might depend on each other, but there could also be another potential trigger, like the temperature, the carbon dioxide, acidity, adenosine, magnesium, potassium ions, or nitric oxide production. But independently of the physiological mechanisms, it was surprising that an increase in blood filling was found during isometric muscle actions. And that's why we are asking how this could be explained. First of all, which would be obvious, is in venous stasis because of the contraction of the muscle fibers and the restriction or occlusion of the capillaries. But we think this could be ruled out because we found in type 1 measurements no increase in the RHB. And also the steady states reveal that the homeostasis is possible. And this homeostasis was also found in type 2 measurements. So the increase of the relative hemoglobin amount could rather be explained by capillary recruitment. And there are three theories. An older one of binary recruitment, which hypothesizes the opening of previously closed capillaries, or the newer one of a continuous or longitudinal recruitment, which says that the already perfused capillaries are more perfused, or there's an homogenization of the already perfused capillaries. And this is more probable according to the newer experimental studies. And the question now is how a capillary capillaries can be recruited despite theoretical high intramuscular pressures during isometric contractions. And that's why we wanted to discuss anatomical approach. And this figure, you can see a cross section of a striated muscle, and the capillaries are primarily located in the corners of 3 to 4 muscle fibers. So, and when muscle fibers contract isometrically, their circumference increases, which leads to an increased space in between where the capillaries are located. So this is seen in this very simplified schematic illustration. And as you can see here, this space would expand when the circumference of the muscle fibers expand. And this could be an approach to understand why the blood filling can increase during isometric muscle actions. And of course, this has to be proven in future studies. Yeah, here's a short look on my references. I also can send you all of them if you want. And now I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward for your questions.
Thank you, Silas, for this talk. Maybe there are some questions.
Ugo, start. Because I did not, maybe I made a short sleeping and I missed the difference between type 1 and type 2. Type 1, what? Type 1 is an exercise, a different exercise?
No. I want to show you the graphic because it's
not the graphic. What is type 1? Is type 1 is the response to something?
No, type 1 refers to the behavioral pattern. So we found 2 different patterns in the behavior of these 2 parameters. And
to the same activation, to the same contraction.
Yes. All participants performed a fatiguing isometric muscle action at 60% of the MVIC, and 5 of them showed this kind of behavior, and 5 of them showed this kind of behavior. So, and
you have no idea to know in advance which type of response you will obtain. There are not trivial.
Not before the measurements. So we only seen this after we've take a look at the data. So
there is something different in these 2 groups of normal persons. What you suggest? Larger fibers? Could be the size of the fibers different?
We haven't examined this. This could, of course, be an approach, and would also be interesting to study in future. But what I can say is that the type 2 behavior might be found more often in participants which are trained more than in type 2 measurements, because some other research groups found that the deoxygenation might be greater in well-trained subjects than in normal trained or not trained.
Could this be related to the tricks of doping by high mountains? The oxygenation is one of the hypotheses. If you have bad oxygenation, you will be a much efficient recordman.
Yeah, of course.
Cyclists do this trick even sleeping. Yeah. By under 10s.
So
you believe that there could be some correlation?
There could also be an influence, such kind of training, or in residence in high altitudes. I think
you have to go to Everest and find and look to the Sherpa if they are type 1 or type 2.
Or maybe we can do a cooperation and do some. I mean, in Italy we also have some high mountains, and maybe we also can do this there.
But Bavaria mountains are high enough.
Yeah, that's right.
Sorry, but
okay. So maybe there could be an influence of the type of muscle fibers, but we have only a few subjects, and so we cannot say anything about this. And we didn't check the performance of the subjects, so this will be open for further research.
I strongly suggest to make the echo Doppler of the muscle and see if they are bigger or not. The first
yeah.
Okay.
Just to see if a bigger muscle is type 1 or type 2.
Okay.
Or if it is related to the muscle fibers size, according to your last to the hypothesis you presented at the end, or not.
I think
maybe
it is hard to imagine what happens then, because in our subjects we have very thin subjects, because we needed to control for the fat layer. So that's why we've chosen very sportive people, and so we cannot say anything about very muscular or muscular people. So
but can ask them to be studied from this simple, starting from a very, very simple hypothesis.
I think
bigger muscle are better even in saturation of red cells. This will be not a trivial results.
But the bigger muscle usually are very short in the duration of performance in high intensity. So it's because they under high intensities they don't consume so much oxygen, but it's more an
my are very naive suggestion.
Thank you very much for this suggestion.